Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for quite a journey. We're heading into the ultimate philosophical paradox, nothingness.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. I mean, it's a concept that feels universally accessible, right?
Right.
We all get zero. We understand absence. But the fundamental difference lies in how global civilizations, especially East and West, actually experience that void.
Exactly. What meaning do we give it? And maybe more importantly, what does assigning that meaning, do to our minds, to our experience of being?
That's the critical tension we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We often assume, I think, that fundamental reality, the ground of existence, is perceived pretty much the same everywhere.
Right. But the sources we're looking at, drawing heavily on thinkers like Nishitani Keiji from the Kyoto School and critics like Kartani Kojin, and then comparing them with Western figures like Heidegger or even psychologists like R.D. Laing, they show something different. They show that this divergence between East and West on nothingness isn't just some, academic footnote. It fundamentally shapes our psychological state, our whole existential condition.
Okay, so our mission here is to take you, our listeners, beyond just the dictionary definition of the void. We want to really unpack this divergence, give you a comprehensive understanding of this core metaphysical split that's, it's shaping global thought.
And the key distinction, as you said earlier, it really seems to hinge on the relationship each culture has with the self, the ego.
Right, the ego. So if we lay down one core premise right at the start, it's this. In the West, nothingness is usually seen as something terrifying, an external obstacle.
Yes, exactly. An abyss that the ego feels it has to constantly struggle against to keep its identity intact. Its hard-won identity. It's something to be fought, to be overcome.
But in the East, and we're talking specifically Japanese Buddhist traditions here, nothingness is different.
Right.
It's the internal, inherent, almost the natural condition of existence itself.
It's the ground, the very ground from which all being, everything that is, arises, not something separate from it.
Okay, so two totally different starting points.
Yeah.
On one side, you've got the Western metaphysical stance. Our sources describe it as having this primacy of being over nothingness. Conceptually, Europe, the whole Platonic Christian tradition, it stands for something. It defines itself by its history, its structure, its substance, its being.
And the self, the Western ego, traditionally sees itself as this self-constructed thing, almost permanent. It insists, quite loudly sometimes, I am.
Right. I think, therefore I am. That whole lineage.
That's the bedrock. But then you contrast that sharply with the Eastern tradition, which starts from a completely different place. Non-dualistic non-essentialism. The idea that being itself is groundless, non-substantial.
And that leads to that really striking philosophical claim you mentioned. I think it was Takuchi Yoshimi, saying Japan is nothing.
Yes, it sounds almost outrageous, doesn't it? To claim a whole culture, a history, a people is fundamentally nothing.
It does. But we have to understand what's meant by nothing here. It's not about deprivation or lack, is it?
Not at all. It's the deep philosophical core. It's the view that this constant striving for substantiality, for permanence, is actually the primary source of our suffering, our dissatisfaction.
So this initial framing, West fights nothingness, East grounds itself in it, that really sets the stage for everything else we're going to explore. Okay, let's dig into the Western tradition first then. Our sources point out that in this framework, nothingness rarely, if ever, shows up as absolute nothingness. The kind someone like Nishida Kitaro was exploring, it's always more relative. What's the difference there?
That difference is absolutely crucial. Absolute nothingness in the Eastern sense is like a transcendental condition. It's a void that exists before all the dualities we create, subject, object, being, non-being, good, evil. It just is.
Yeah.
Relative nothingness in the West tends to be defined by what it's not. It's an absence. It's the whole left behind when some meaningful structure collapses.
I see, like the death of God, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The death of God, the collapse of those fixed moral certainties we used to rely on, the maybe disillusionment with Enlightenment rationalism. All these things leave a void, but it's a void defined by what used to be there.
So it's not pure emptiness. It's more like a negative space that's shaped by the presence that's now missing.
Precisely. And what's really fascinating and kind of paradoxical is that because the Western mind is so geared towards recognizing and, struggling against this void, it ends up almost substantializing it, making it into a thing.
Making nothingness into a something.
Sort of, yeah. It's not just seen as mere absence. It becomes this positive negative, a palpable, often threatening thing in itself. Think of that phrase, the empty throne of God. The throne is empty, yes, but the emptiness itself implies a significant, powerful lack. It still exerts this influence, like a huge magnetic field, maybe, seductive sometimes, terrifying other times, but always pulling structures towards potential collapse.
And that fear of collapse, that magnetic pull, that leads directly into what Karatani Kojin calls the core Western project.
Yeah.
The will to architecture.
Yes. This deep, almost instinctual drive coming down from Plato through Christianity to build solid, permanent foundations.
We see it everywhere, don't we? Plato searching for those perfect, unchanging forms. The church building its structure of certainty. Descartes looking for that one undeniable point. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The solid ground for the self.
Absolutely. The entire history of Western metaphysics, a lot of science, even political theory, you could argue, has been this quest for the ultimate archa, the ungrounded ground, the first principle that can provide stable structure and guarantee some kind of permanence against the chaos, against the void.
And this drive leads us to build philosophical systems, moral codes, legal frameworks, and crucially for our discussion, a substantial self.
An ego that believes it can stand firm, maybe even master the world.
A masterable world built on solid ground. That's the goal. So, if that's the fundamental impulse to construct, to stabilize, to build walls against the void, then nothingness immediately becomes the enemy. It's the active opposing force.
It has to be. It gets cast as the nihilistic engine of deconstruction, the thing that's always trying to undermine the beautiful, rational structures we build.
The encounter then can't be peaceful. It has to be antagonistic.
Inherently antagonistic. The sources describe it as painful, frightening, often violent. Nothingness becomes the abyss. It's seen as the greatest potential violence that could possibly be inflicted on the ego.
Why the greatest violence?
Because it threatens to completely erase the self's carefully constructed boundaries, its achievements, its very sense of being. Total dissolution. The ego feels it cannot afford to just integrate this force peacefully. It feels it must fight to survive. It must maintain its structure.
And the aim of this constant fight, is it just survival?
At its core, yes. Self-maintenance. But it often goes further. The self actively engages in this conflict, sometimes trying to steal the power of deconstruction for itself.
Steal it.
By becoming the destroyer of old forms, old ideas, so it can rebuild newer, stronger ones in their place. Think of revolutionary movements, artistic avant-gardes. There's often this impulse to tear down in order to build something better, something more resilient.
But isn't there a contradiction there? You're trying to build permanence, but you're using the very force of impermanence, of deconstruction, to do it.
That's the inherent tension. This constant struggle of being over nothing, as the sources put it, inevitably results in self-contradiction. You're trying to build a permanent house on a foundation you've just admitted is inherently unstable, maybe even non-existent. The project is always, always incomplete, eternally striving.
And this psychological position, this constant striving and inherent contradiction, this really defines the human condition in the Western view, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's characterized by that deep sense of angst.
Anxiety.
Yes, angst. It's not just everyday fear or worry. It's that fundamental existential anxiety. Heidegger links it to the experience of the ontological difference.
The ontological difference.
The gap between.
The unbearable gap between being itself, the eternal, stable essence we seem to crave, and beings, the temporary, mortal, contingent things we actually are. Us, chairs, stars, everything that just is for a while and then isn't.
So, because the Western ego insists on being this permanent, substantial thing.
Right, it wants to be being.
The realization of its own groundlessness, the fact that it could cease to exist, that it's just contingent, that's what causes this chronic, deep anxiety.
That's the idea. This angst is what then drives the Western self into this state of perpetual motion, always searching, seeking, grasping for something to fill the void, something to hold on to, always trying to transcend its own limits, become more than it is.
To escape contingency.
Exactly. The ultimate goal becomes continuous self-maintenance and endless self-creation. This later becomes the bedrock of existential freedom, especially in Sartre.
Condemned to be free.
Right. But think about that condemnation. If I must constantly choose, constantly define myself, create myself out of nothing, I'm never allowed to just be, I can never rest. The burden of infinite freedom, infinite creation is immense precisely because the foundation is perceived as nothing, as a terrifying void.
And all this intense internal struggle, this constant self-creation and anxiety, results in what R.D. Laing called the divided self.
How does this conflict with nothingness actually create that kind of schizoid split?
It's like the subject-object duality, the split between observer and observed that's so core to Western thought, gets turned inwards. The self splits into two.
Two selves.
Yeah, there's the observing self, the part that's trying to analyze, fix, build, control, maintain. And then there's the observed self, the anxious, transient, flawed entity that's being analyzed and judged.
Ah, okay, the inner critic and the one being criticized. Kind of, yeah. And Laing saw this split, this self-contradiction, as a kind of chronic pathology, made much worse when the person confronts nihilism directly. The self gets trapped because its fundamental desire, what Nishitani calls the deep attachment to the self, forces it to remain separate. Separate from itself, separate from the ground of reality, always observing its own struggle.
Which really confirms, then, that within this Western framework, nothingness almost always gets equated with death, with loss, with absence, with deprivation.
Overwhelmingly so. You see it so clearly in Heidegger. His concept of design human existence is defined as being towards death.
Right, facing finitude.
For Heidegger, nothingness is the ultimate deprivation, yes, but it's also the necessary limit. It's the boundary that forces the individual to confront their own finitude and through that confrontation, hopefully choose an authentic existence.
But notice, even in that really radical thinking,
Yes.
nothingness is still functioning as an external boundary, right?
Well,
It's an impossible other that limits our existence.
yeah.
It's not presented as the internal ground that actually powers existence.
Exactly. It remains the ultimate negative force. Heidegger makes the encounter with it heroic, profound, deeply serious. But it's still a confrontation. It prevents that non-dual union of being and nothingness that we see in the East. Nothingness is the wall Dasein runs up against, not the field in which it plays.
Okay, so now let's do the big philosophical flip. Let's pivot to the East, specifically looking at the Mahayana Buddhist tradition that profoundly shaped Japanese thought. Here, the experience of nothingness, which they call emptiness, ku, or śūnyatā, it's radically different, isn't it?
It's a complete metaphysical reversal. Śūnyatā isn't absence or deprivation in that Western sense at all. It's understood as the transcendental reality, the very space, you could say, where the ego simply dissolves.
Dissolves, why?
Because from this perspective, the ego never truly existed as a permanent, solid, independent entity in the first place. The core teaching is non-substantiality. Reality, all phenomena, are inherently void of permanent, unchanging, substantial being.
Wow. Okay, so if the West operates on the assumption that being is the default state and nothingness is this threat creeping in, the East flips it. Nothingness or emptiness is the fundamental state. That's the starting point.
Precisely. The void isn't some distant, terrifying abyss out there. It's completely immanent. It's right here, right now. It's the functioning ground of everything we experience.
So the whole idea of a solid, separate self
Is seen as an illusion, a construct, rooted, as they might say, in ignorance or misunderstanding. The idea is there is no wish to maintain the self because the self itself does not exist in that substantial way.
So the response to realizing this groundlessness isn't anxiety.
No, it's relief, it's recognition. It's waking up from the exhausting dream of trying to be a separate, solid thing.
Okay, so if the Western mind's instinct, as Karatani said, is the will to architecture, builds solid structures against the void, what's the Eastern attitude towards structure? Is it just chaos?
Not chaos, but definitely different. According to Karatani's analyses, that fundamental will to architecture, it doesn't really exist in the same way in traditional Japanese metaphysics.
It doesn't exist.
Not as that primary defensive drive. Instead, the idea is that deconstructive forces, the natural processes of impermanence, change, dissolution, are always at work, effortlessly, naturally.
So there's no frantic building project to resist the void.
Not in the same way. The system, reality itself, is seen as already self-deconstructing. Always in a state of natural dynamic flux, like a river, always flowing, always changing, yet always itself.
That suggests existence itself is more like a calm flow of dissolution, which must drastically change how you see struggle, hardship.
It changes absolutely everything. The reaction to this absolute nothingness, this śūnyatā, is seen in fundamentally positive, much calmer terms. Nothingness isn't the enemy you have to fight tooth and nail.
What is it then?
It's the necessary condition. The non-dual standpoint that dissolves all fixed standpoints, including the standpoint of a fixed self from within. It's both immanent, right here, and transcendental, beyond all concepts.
So there's this fundamental non-confrontational presupposition.
Yeah.
being and nothingness aren't opposites fighting each other.
Exactly. They aren't in conflict. They're mutually constitutive, like two sides of the same coin. You can't have form without emptiness. You can't have emptiness without form. That's the Heart Sutra, in essence.
Okay, this grounding naturally leads us to a very different psychology, the psychology of non-attachment.
Yeah.
If the Western self is defined by angst, by the perpetual need to grasp, maintain, define its identity, what's the goal here?
The goal is fundamentally to get rid of desire and fear, or maybe, more accurately, to see through them. Because desire, grasping, and fear, aversion, are seen as the twin engines that power the illusion of the separate, substantial ego. They keep us trapped in that cycle of suffering.
But does seeing through desire and fear mean life becomes bland, empty in a bad way?
Not according to this tradition. Traditional Japanese thought often manages this incredible synthesis. It combines philosophies of radical nothingness, of emptiness, with a really powerful life-affirming immanence.
How does that work?
It recognizes the total impermanence of the world, yes, but it grounds that impermanence in emptiness, which means change isn't a tragedy or a loss to be feared. It's just the natural, dynamic expression of reality itself. It's how things are, and there can be incredible beauty and depth in that flow.
So the encounter with the void, with emptiness, results in liberation, not pathology, not the divided self.
Precisely. The desired outcome is often referred to as ego death, but this isn't meant pathologically, like in a psychotic break. It's a metaphysical achievement. It's waking up to the way things truly are.
And life, then, isn't seen as a struggle against nothingness, but...
Life is seen as being powered by nothingness. Emptiness isn't a lack. It's pure, unhindered, dynamic potentiality. It's the source from which everything arises and into which everything dissolves.
And realizing this leads to...
a cessation of that frantic striving. Peace, just for the sake of peace. Silence, for the sake of silence. Not as goals to achieve through effort, but as the natural state that emerges when the struggle stops.
Which brings us to that ultimate metaphysical conclusion, the resolution of the self-contradiction that seems to trap the Western mind. It's that simple but radical non-duality. World, self, being, nothingness.
They all collapse into one seamless reality, no fundamental splits.
Okay, with those two opposing stances, the Western struggle and the Eastern acceptance clearly laid out, we can really start to appreciate the depth of the critiques that thinkers like Nishitani and Karatani were making against Western thought.
Yeah, they weren't just offering an alternative. They were using their own non-dualistic understanding of being nothingness to fundamentally challenge the core assumptions of Western reason, especially that idea of a stable, transcendental subjectivity, a fixed self.
Let's start with how they saw Western nihilism, not just as a philosophical position, but almost as a self-conscious pathology. Drawing on Nishitani, but also connecting with someone like Lang's psychological work.
Yeah.
If the Western self is already inherently divided, how does nihilism bring that pathology right to the surface?
Well, the core pathology from this viewpoint is the sheer clinginess of the ego. Even when the Western nihilist confronts the terrifying groundlessness of the world, the realization that maybe God is dead, there are no absolute values, everything is ultimately meaningless even then, the ego clings desperately to its own existence.
Oh, so?
It clings to itself as the ultimate arbiter of that meaninglessness. It insists on being the one experiencing the void, the one suffering from the lack of meaning. It holds on to its two separate selves that Lang talked about, the self that's asking the devastating questions and the self that's being devastated at the answers, or lack thereof.
The observer and the observed again.
Exactly. Lang called it the schizoid split. The self is perpetually watching itself fail, watching itself suffer in the face of nothingness, but it won't let go of being the watcher or the sufferer.
So the nihilist breakthrough, that moment of confronting the abyss in thinkers like Kierkegaard or Heidegger, it's seen as this painful realization that the self has to somehow become one, integrated.
Mm-hmm.
But the path to get there is through angst.
It's presented as a path of almost heroic torture. The encounter with the abyss is meant to be painful, dangerous. Heidegger even talks about a kind of physical nausea. You're forced to confront the lack of a ground, yes, but you do it by exerting this immense self-will. You try to achieve wholeness or authenticity through an act of existential violence against your own previous comfortable, substantial self.
And Nishitani argues this whole process is based on a mistake.
A fundamental misrecognition of the nature of nothingness and the nature of the self. He sees it as still caught within that framework of struggle, of trying to conquer the void rather than realizing one's identity with it.
This leads directly to a specific critique of Heidegger, right? Even though Heidegger's seen by many as taking Western thought closest to this edge, this encounter with nothingness, why did Nishitani ultimately find Heidegger's position still limited?
The key is Heidegger's emphasis on design human existence being defined by its being towards death. For Heidegger, death is the ultimate possibility, the absolute limit that individualizes us and forces us towards authenticity.
Okay.
But by relying on death, on finitude, as the primary way nothingness enters the picture, Nishitani argues Heidegger is fundamentally still using an external limit to define the self. Death is the boundary that stops being.
He called it a kind of secularized Christian penitence.
Yes, it's like you achieve authenticity only by accepting the ultimate punishment or limit death, which defines your substantial individual being by its end. It's still setting up nothingness as death against being as life.
So the failure, from the Eastern perspective, is that nothingness remains this external limiting boundary. It's not internalized as the very ground of existence itself.
Precisely. Heidegger gets incredibly close. He makes the encounter profound, world-shattering, serious, but he ultimately prevents that final step, the non-dual union of being and nothingness. Nothingness remains the impossible, other that Dasein must heroically, anxiously confront. The fundamental tension, the split, remains.
And this tension, this self-contradiction, gets maybe even more amplified when you look at the more radical forms of existentialism, like Max Stirner or Jean-Paul Sartre.
Oh, absolutely. Stirner, for example, took the individual ego to its absolute, perhaps narcissistic extreme. He articulated this kind of inverted will to architecture with his famous line, Ich hab mein Sach auf nichts gestellt. I have founded my affairs on nothing. Meaning he rejected all external authorities, all spooks like God, state, humanity, morality. He defined his unique ego as the nothing of all else. He collapsed all value systems down to the radically individual, secular ego. But, and this is crucial, this nothing that he founded his affairs on was still insisted upon as my all. The ego remained the ultimate substantial subject, now supposedly empowered by its own total lack of external grounding. It became its own God, founded on nothing.
Still a very strong assertion of self.
Very strong. And then you have Nishitani's critique of Sartre, which is honestly one of the most powerful arguments in the source material we looked at against that Western obsession with radical freedom.
What's the core of that critique?
It's devastating because it hits the very heart of Sartrean freedom. Sartre argues famously that we are condemned to be free. We exist first, and then we must define ourselves through our choices. We have to create oneself continually in order to maintain oneself within nothing.
That sounds exhausting.
Exactly. Nishitani looks at this and says, this relentless, perpetual act of self-creation, this constant striving to define and maintain yourself against the backdrop of nothingness. This is the most profound form of this attachment to the self.
So trying to be free in Sartre's way actually traps you more.
That's the argument. The existential self, striving ceaselessly to forge its identity on the ground of nothing, is merely trapping itself deeper within its own prison of self-contradiction. It achieves nothingness only as an external condition, an object which the self remains fundamentally attached to and defined against. It completely misses the positive freedom that comes from non-attachment, from realizing the self is emptiness.
So the key Western failure, running through all this, seems to be that our forms of nihilism, even the most radical ones, fail to internalize nihility in its positive core. We keep equating nothingness with the powers of death, with erasure, limitation, absence, lack.
Rather than seeing it as the dynamic, generative, life-giving powers of life, as pure potentiality, as groundlessness that enables all arising, all creativity, all flow.
Yeah. And this failure isn't just psychological or existential. Karatani Kojin gives it a structural dimension, too, with his analysis of architecture and the zero sign.
Right. Karatani argues that the whole Western philosophical tradition, from Plato onwards, is fundamentally rooted in this will to architecture, this deep drive to build closed, stable, self-referential systems, always looking for that ultimate solid foundation.
Metaphysics as architecture.
Exactly. And deconstruction then, whether it's Derrida or others, is simply the process that attempts to undermine metaphysics as it has developed from Plato. It tries to show the cracks in the foundation.
But the inherent contradiction, as you mentioned before, is that the very attempt to construct this perfectly solid edifice inevitably ends up revealing the absence of its own foundation, right? Like Gödel hitting the limits of formal systems in mathematics.
Precisely. The harder you try to build a perfect closed system, the more you bump up against its inherent incompleteness, its reliance on something outside itself, or its own internal inconsistencies. Karatani uses semiotics. the study of signs, to illustrate the structural difference between West and East.
How does semiotics show this?
In the West, if you trace the chain of signifiers, words pointing to concepts pointing to other words, the underlying assumption or desire is to eventually reach a final grounding signifier, the transcendental signified. Historically, that was God, or maybe reason, or man, or the cogito, something that stops the chain and guarantees meaning. It closes the system.
Yeah.
Now, even when post-structuralists tried to decenter language using a kind of floating zero sign, a signifier that marks an absence or difference at the heart of the system, Karatani argues that, in the West, this zero sign often ends up functioning merely as a proxy for God or the transcendental ego. It still serves to hold the structure together, even by marking its central lack. The signifier for nothing still ends up defining the boundaries of the system.
So even our attempts in the West to break free, whether it's through existentialist angst or post-structuralist language games, are still ultimately performed by a Western ego that requires some kind of ground, some kind of structure, even if that ground is designated nothing and needs constant, anxious reaffirmation.
That's Karatani's point. It's still architecture, even if it's the architecture of the void. He contrasts this sharply with how Roland Barthes interpreted Japanese culture in his Empire of Signs.
What did Barthes see there?
He saw a cultural space where the zero sign śūnyatā, emptiness, functions very differently. It's not marking a lack within a structure. It is the structureless structure. It's the negation of absence itself. It functions as essential emptiness, which isn't a deficit, but pure dynamic potential.
And what does that do to the signs, to meaning?
It emancipates them completely. Because there's no ultimate essence or transcendental signified to anchor them, the signifiers can just float, shift, and play freely. The system remains open, dynamic, ungrounded. And crucially, it does this without requiring the constant anxiety and effort of a substantial self, trying to manage or fight the void. The void is the freedom.
Okay, let's try and bring this really dense philosophical battleground back down to earth, back to the contemporary world. If we take these ideas seriously, the Western psychological dilemma starts to look less like just an academic problem and more like, well, like a kind of collective illness.
That's certainly how someone like R.D. Laing saw it, and how Nishitani might frame it too. Think about modernity, late capitalism, the sheer overwhelming nature of radical freedom. It places this almost unbearable burden of choice on the individual.
Choice of what?
Choice of everything. What to believe, who to be, what to consume, which ideology to follow, how to find meaning. We live in what Laing called a spiritual vacuum, where the old certainties are gone, and the sheer volume of possibilities can become paralyzing.
The feeling that everything and nothing is possible at the same time.
Exactly. And that feeling, Laing argued, can lead directly back to that schizophrenic self-split. The self feels compelled to constantly curate its identity, affirm its choices, defend its brand against this torrent of information and possibility, but it also feels fundamentally unable to commit, unable to find solid ground.
That resonates. That sense of paralysis, of being overwhelmed by options but feeling empty inside. That sounds pretty familiar in today's world. We're constantly searching for meaning, aren't we? Whether it's through consumerism or latching onto ideologies or endless self-help programs.
Right. Trying to fill that fundamental metaphysical gap, that perceived void. But the crucial point is that the search itself is often driven by the very angst it's trying to quell. We end up performing that Sartrean dilemma, condemned to choose, condemned to create meaning on a massive societal scale. And it's exhausting.
And why do we react this specific way? Why the anxiety, the frantic building, the paralysis?
Because, going back to the core difference, the self-protective Western mind still instinctively perceives the void, perceives groundlessness, as the greatest potential violence that could ever be perpetrated against the ego. Our chronic cultural anxiety, whether it shows up as information overload, political polarization, identity crises, you could see it all as a vast defense mechanism against dissolution.
We're building psychological walls, political walls, cultural walls, all part of that will to architecture.
Trying to protect the fragile ego from the perhaps inevitable truth of its own non-substantiality, we shore up the self against the void.
Okay, so what's really crucial then about the intervention by thinkers like Nishitani and Karatani is that they aren't just saying, hey, here's a different way to look at things over here. They're doing something more radical.
Much more radical. They're operating from that fundamentally different ontology, the non-dualistic view of being nothingness, and using it to provide this incredibly powerful outsider's perspective. But it's an outsider's perspective that quickly transforms into an internal critique of Western reason itself.
How does it become internal?
By forcing Western thought to confront its own deep internal contradictions. By starting from the premise that the ground of existence is non-substantiality, is emptiness, they can take core Western concepts like structure, the state, the self, the object, and reduce them, expose them, down to their fundamental nihility.
Showing the emptiness within the structures we build.
Exactly. They demonstrate that the very desire for fixed stability, for permanent architecture, is the mechanism that actually generates the instability, the anxiety, the self-contradiction we experience. The cure is the disease, in a way.
And the practical philosophical takeaway from this powerful critique, what's the imperative?
It leads directly to this call for the abnegation of the will to architecture, a conscious letting go of that frantic need to build, define, defend, and stabilize the self and its world. It's a path toward overcoming nihilism, not by finding a new, better foundation, but by embracing groundlessness. It emphasizes non-attachment, letting go of the craving for permanence and nonviolence. And that nonviolence isn't just directed outwards towards others, it's directed inwards towards the aggressive, anxious, self-contradictory ego itself. You stop fighting yourself, stop trying to build the unbuildable, and you simply let be, allow the flow.
So this whole historical clash of perspectives where the West seems to preach lack, absence, and antagonism towards nothingness, and the East preaches fulfillment, inherent unity, and acceptance of nothingness, it really points towards the need, or at least the possibility, for a new kind of philosophical program. A synthesis.
It certainly suggests that possibility, maybe a third way that tries to synthesize the best aspects of both traditions. Because clearly the Western tradition has brought immense value. Well, that very impulse for self-differentiation, for critical questioning, the development of individual rights, political enlightenment, the incredible power of scientific inquiry, the exploration of unique individual potential. These are powerful and valuable drives.
We wouldn't want to just abandon those.
No. But perhaps that necessary differentiation, that critical spirit, could be grounded differently, grounded in the Eastern attitude of holistic calm and self-acceptance, even and especially in the face of ultimate groundlessness.
So keep the critical edge, the drive to explore, but lose the existential panic.
Something like that. Achieving that ultimate realization. Being as nothingness. It's sometimes referenced metaphorically as a Buddha-Christ synthesis, integrating the profound depth of emptiness with the compassionate engagement in the world of form. Where nothingness isn't the enemy of being, but integrated into being.
And how does that resolve the self-split nonviolently, the divided self?
The split resolves when the observer and the observed finally recognize their inherent unity in the dynamic void. When the Western ego stops fighting the void as an external threat and instead recognizes that void not as an absence of foundation, but as the infinitely generative empty ground of all possible foundations.
So the tension just dissolves.
The tension of self-contradiction, that exhausting need for perpetual self-creation just to prove one's own existence. It dissolves into a kind of effortless acceptance, a dynamic freedom that's powered by the very emptiness it once feared, rather than fighting against it.
Wow. Okay, so this entire deep dive really lays bare this profound metaphysical chasm separating these two fundamental ways of experiencing reality. On the one hand, you have the Western self, seemingly trapped in self-contradiction, perpetually tense, condemned to be free, precisely because it fights nothingness as this external enemy.
The anxious architect.
And on the other hand, you have the potential, seen in the Eastern perspective, for the self to find peace, maybe even fulfillment, by recognizing that inherent non-dual unity, world self-being, nothingness.
It really boils down to the difference between viewing the lack of a final, solid foundation as a terrifying tragedy, something to be mourned, resisted, and constantly fought against, or viewing that very lack of foundation as the ultimate liberation, as the condition that allows everything to flow, to change, to arise and pass away without the heavy burden of permanence.
And that profound affinity, that potential meeting point between the most radical outcomes of Western thought pushing against its own limits and Eastern philosophy. It's captured in that succinct phrase you mentioned earlier, the one Japanese scholars sometimes use when discussing the convergence with Heidegger.
Yes. Being, nothing, same. In that ultimate realization, the distinction collapses.
That is a powerful final thought to leave things on. It really makes you reflect. If our fundamental cultural blueprint, the very way we're taught to think and feel, determines whether we experience the basic ground of reality as a terrifying external abyss that we must conquer, or as an effortless, inherent, life-affirming void that is our very nature, Well, it leads to a provocative question for you, the listener.
How much of your own daily striving, your moments of chronic anxiety, your deep-seated impulse to build, define, and defend, how much of that is just inherited architecture, a cultural habit? And how much, if any, is truly inherent to existence itself? That's a question of groundlessness to carry with you.